This is a homily for the feast of the presentation of the Lord. The first reading is from the prophet Malachi, chapter 3, verses 1 to 4. The Gospel for this Sunday comes from the Gospel of St. Luke, chapter 2, verses 22 to 40. To download the text of this homily as a PDF file, go to sundayhomilies.au. In the Church's liturgical calendar, we are in the period of ordinary time that bridges the Christmas season and the beginning of Lent. This year, the fourth Sunday of ordinary time falls on February the 2nd, so the feast of the presentation of the Lord takes precedence in the Church's liturgical calendar. Last Sunday's Gospel took us to the beginning of the public ministry, with Jesus returning to his hometown of Nazareth. Today, however, we're going back to the infancy narrative, to the episode that we traditionally call the presentation of the Lord in the temple. It's the fourth decade of the joyful mysteries of the Rosary. But before we consider today's Gospel in closer detail, let us look briefly at the first reading from the prophet Malachi. The Hebrew Bible was originally a collection of scrolls rather than a book, and there were three main collections of scrolls. They were the Torah or Law, which contained 5 scrolls, the Nevi'im or Prophets, which contained 8 scrolls, and the Ketuvim or Writings, which contained 11 scrolls. All the books of the Hebrew Bible are contained in the Christian Old Testament, but arranged differently. When Christians eventually configured the Old Testament, they began with the Torah or Pentateuch, but they placed the prophets at the end of the book. This means that Malachi, the last of the minor prophets, is the final word spoken in the Christian Old Testament. Although Luke wrote his Gospel long before this decision about canonical ordering was finalized, he anticipated its logic. Today's first reading from chapter 3 of the prophet Malachi comes from the final book of the Bible in the Christian configuration of the Old Testament, and it therefore functions as a bridge to the New Testament. We read, "Look, I am sending my messenger to prepare the way before me. And suddenly the Lord whom you seek will come to his temple." It's almost as though Malachi is giving us a preview of what is about to unfold. So let us now see what happens when the Lord comes to his temple. In today's Gospel, Luke stresses that Mary and Joseph are devout and pious Jews who were faithful to all the requirements of the Mosaic Law. Luke tells us of 3 ancient ceremonies that Joseph and Mary observed following the birth of Jesus. Firstly, the circumcision and naming of the child. Secondly, purification following childbirth. And finally, the presentation of the child. In chapter 2, verse 21, that's immediately before the beginning of today's Gospel, we're told that Jesus was circumcised and named. Luke is reminding his readers that Jesus was a Jew. Circumcision was so sacred a ritual that the ceremony could be carried out even on the Sabbath, and that was a day on which the Jewish law forbade almost every act that wasn't absolutely essential. After a boy was circumcised, he then forever bore in his flesh the sign that he was one of God's chosen people. It was on the day of his circumcision that a boy formally received his name. When the angel Gabriel appeared to Mary, he told her that she would conceive and bear a son, and that she shall name him Jesus. Our English pronunciation of the name, Jesus, comes to us through the Greek, the language of the New Testament. The name in Greek is Jesus. The name in Hebrew is Yeshua. It was a common Jewish name, and in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, made about 200 BC, the name Jesus occurs over 270 times. The longer form of the name is Yehoshua, which is translated as Joshua in English Bibles. The shorter form of the name is Yeshua. For an ancient Hebrew speaker, these were really just two variations of the same name. Yehoshua, or Joshua, as we pronounce it in English, is the longer form of the name. The shorter and later form of the name is Yeshua. It would seem that by the 1st century AD, the shorter form of the name, Yeshua, prevailed. So I think it would be safe to say that the Hebrew name underlying the Greek Jesus in the New Testament is the shorter form of the Hebrew name, and that is Yeshua. The original meaning of Yehoshua was Yahweh helps, from the root to help. However, a popular etymology connected the name and its shortened form with the root to save and the noun salvation. So the name is the key to this child's identity. This child is the saving presence of God among us. We come to the second ceremony. Today's Gospel begins with Luke telling us that when the day came for them to be purified, as laid down by the law of Moses, Joseph and Mary took Jesus up to Jerusalem. Although Luke seems to suggest that both parents needed to be purified, it was only the mother who needed to be purified. A woman who bore a male child was considered unclean for 40 days. At this point, we need to understand an important point about purification. It has nothing to do with sin. The mother is not being purified because she has sinned in any way, nor is there any suggestion that the process of childbirth is in some way sinful. The purification that the mother undergoes expresses a very moving and profound truth. To understand what purification is all about, we need to keep in mind that Judaism drew a sharp line of demarcation between the profane and the sacred. The etymology of the word profane is interesting. It means literally outside the temple. Fanum is the Latin word for temple, and the prefix pro means, in this context, outside. The temple is a sacred space. The profane is any space beyond or outside the temple. When Jewish priests offered sacrifice, they had first to be purified, and they had to wear special vestments. Nothing secular could enter into the presence of God. Giving birth is a creative act. The mother participates in God's act of creation. When she gives birth, she enters the sacred and becomes one with the Creator. So before returning to secular life, the mother marked the end of her contact with the divine through the ritual of purification. The mother had to make an offering of a year-old lamb and a turtle dove or a pigeon. If she was poor, she made the offering of a pair of turtle doves. So the parents of Jesus are portrayed as being among the poor of the land. Thirdly, there is the presentation of the child. Mary and Joseph took Jesus up to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. This was known as the redemption of the firstborn. In the book of Exodus, the Lord tells Moses, "Consecrate all the firstborn to me, the firstborn from every womb among the Israelites, whether human or animal, it is mine." The firstborn child belonged to God, and the parents had therefore to buy the child back from the Lord. Although Luke omits details of the payment, it was an amount of 5 sanctuary shekels. 5 sanctuary shekels was equal to 20 denarii. 1 denarius is the daily wage for a labourer, so 20 denarii is the equivalent of a labourer's wage for 20 days. This sum of money could simply be forwarded. Actually, taking the child to the temple was not required. Behind this ancient ceremony of the redemption of the firstborn is the conviction that a child is a gift of God. In the words of Father Ronald Rolheiser, "The children we have are not really ours. They are given to us in trust for a time, a short time really, and we are asked to be mothers and fathers, mentors, guardians, protectors, teachers, and friends to them. But they are never really our children. If we understand this, we will be less inclined to act as owners, to manipulate our children for our own needs, to see them as satellites within our own orbits." In the 1968 movie Rachel, Rachel, directed by Paul Newman and starring Joanne Woodward, the main character is a 35-year-old unmarried schoolteacher, Rachel, who feels as though she's wasted her life. She lives at home with her mother and has devoted her life to teaching other people's children rather than having a family of her own. Rachel complains to another woman, who is a mother, how difficult it is for her to work intimately with her students in the classroom, to get to know them so well, only to have them move onwards at the end of the year and inevitably grow away from her. Rachel envies women who have their own children. But a mother who has been listening to Rachel says in reply, "It is not so different for a parent. You also get to have your children only for a short time. They move on and grow away from you. They have their own lives and don't belong to you. In the end, even for parents, your kids are never really your own." Although our children are not really ours, we do have a profound influence upon them. This photograph, published in the Sydney Morning Herald a few years ago, illustrates what I mean. The photograph was taken by the young girl's father, who had strapped a camera to his chest as he swirled his daughter around. But look closely at the young girl's eyes. They reflect the image of her father, and therein lies a profound truth. As parents, we leave our image upon the lives of our children. It is our task to educate our children, but education is not really about filling their minds with everything we think they need to know. Etymologically, The word education comes from the Latin educare, which means to lead out. In other words, education is a process of helping someone else to discover the gifts, the abilities, the talents that are already theirs, and to help bring them to birth, to bring them forth. Let me illustrate what I mean. Death Valley is a national park in California. It is the lowest, driest, and hottest area in North America. It's called Death Valley because it is so dry that almost nothing grows there. It almost never rains. If you go to Google Images and type in Death Valley, California, you will find many photographs of an incredibly beautiful landscape, but a landscape dry and barren. Virtually nothing can grow there. It seems lifeless, harsh, and dry. Not a blade of grass to be seen, not a bush, shrub, or tree in sight. This is more like a lunar landscape, or perhaps Mars, totally alien to life. It almost never rains there. But in the winter of 2004, there was a torrential downpour. More than 8 inches of rain fell in a very short time. And what a transformation that downpour had. Death Valley was totally transformed. Google Death Valley Spring 2005 and you will find photographs of Death Valley carpeted by a spectacular array of wildflowers. The barren desert landscape had been transformed. So Death Valley wasn't dead, but dormant. The seeds of all those wildflowers were waiting beneath the desert sands for the transformative power of the rain. And therein lies a parable. Within all of us are seeds of possibility waiting for the right conditions to come about before they can sprout into life. A perfect metaphor for education at its best. Let's now turn to the 2 elderly Israelites whom we meet in today's Gospel, Simeon and Anna. Luke presents them as faithful Israelites who hang upon the ancient promises God has made to Israel. Through prayer and fasting, they are best equipped to recognize the promised salvation when it eventually comes. Simeon, who was promised that he would not see death before he had seen the Lord's Messiah, is able to discern in this very ordinary family from the poorer class the fulfillment of God's promises to Israel. Simeon's great prayer is known to us today by its Latin title, the Nunc Dimittis. Since the 5th century, this canticle has been recited every day at Compline or night prayer. At last, O powerful Master, you give leave to your servant to go in peace according to your promise. For my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared for all nations, the light to enlighten the Gentiles, and give glory to Israel your people. Luke is making an important point here. This child is to be, first of all, a light to enlighten the Gentiles, and only secondly, to give glory to Israel, God's people. So here in Luke's infancy narrative is a reminder that the gospel, the good news, is not only for the people of Israel, it is good news for all nations. Last Sunday, the 3rd Sunday in Ordinary Time, we heard the beginning of Luke's account of Jesus returning home to Nazareth. He went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He reads from chapter 61 of the prophet Isaiah, and then sits down. The eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him, and he said, "Today this text has been fulfilled in your hearing." If this Sunday were not the feast of the presentation, and we were instead listening to the Gospel for the fourth Sunday in ordinary time, we would have heard what happened next in the synagogue at Nazareth. Jesus reminds the people of Nazareth of God's graciousness to two people who were not Jewish. Stories told in the first book and second book of Kings. Firstly, during a time of severe famine, God sends the prophet Elijah to a widow in Zarephath, a Sidonian town. The widow was a Gentile, not an Israelite, living in a Phoenician town on the Mediterranean coast between Tyre and Sidon. Elijah assures the widow, who was on the verge of starvation, that her supply of flour and oil will not run out until the drought ends. Jesus then reminds the people of a story in which the prophet Elisha heals a Syrian leper by the name of Naaman. Naaman was the commander of the army of Syria. Jesus then says, "In truth I tell you, there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's day, when heaven remained shut for 3 years and 6 months, and great famine raged throughout the land. But Elijah was not sent to any one of these, but only to a widow at Zarephath, a town in Sidonia. And there were many lepers in Israel in the prophet Elisha's time, but none of these was cured, only Naaman the Syrian." The townsfolk of Nazareth find this intolerable, and their mood turns ugly. They hustled him out of the town and took him up to the brow of the hill on which their town was built, intending to throw him off the cliff, but he passed through the midst of them and walked away. This takes us back to Simeon's canticle. Jesus is to be a light to enlighten the Gentiles. He is the embodiment of God's hospitality, of God's welcome not only to Israel, but to Gentiles as well. Christian tradition has given Simeon the title Theotokos, a Greek word which means receiver of God. On this feast of the presentation of the Lord, let us all pray that we also may become a Theotokos, a receiver of God. Alongside the prophet Simeon, there now appears the prophetess Anna, an 84-year-old woman whose husband had died after 7 years of marriage. Given that girls at that time were given in marriage at the age of 12 or 13, we may assume that Anna had been widowed for well over 60 years. She had not become bitter at her misfortune, but rather she is the model of the truly devout person. The supreme moment in her life, the hour of Jesus' appearance in the temple, comes towards the very end of her life. She has waited patiently a long time for this moment. Let's reflect upon that theme of waiting patiently. We're reminded in today's second reading from the letter to the Hebrews that Jesus took to himself descent from Abraham. Abraham, like Anna and Simeon, offers us a lesson in waiting patiently. We first meet Abraham and his family in chapter 11 of the book of Genesis. They live in their native land, Ur of the Chaldeans. Abraham's father, Terah, decides to move to the land of Canaan and sets out with Abraham, Abraham's wife Sarah, and Terah's grandson Lot. However, when they arrive at Haran, the family settles there. We're also told in chapter 11 that Abraham's wife Sarah was barren. In Haran, God calls Abraham, "Go forth from your land and your birthplace and your father's house to the land I will show you, and I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and those who damn you I will curse, and all the clans of the earth through you shall be blessed." Abraham is 75 years old. Just think about God's call for a moment. God promises a 75-year-old man whose wife is barren that he will make him a great nation. Abraham points out to God that he is childless. He has no descendants. His heir will not therefore be his own son, but some man of his household. However, God assures him that his heir shall be of his own flesh and blood. God then takes Abraham outside and says, "Look up to the heavens and count the stars, if you can count them. So shall be your seed." Abraham puts his faith in God's promise, but that promise is not fulfilled immediately. Sarah gives birth to Isaac when Abraham is 100 years old. So between God's first calling Abraham and the birth of Isaac, there is a gap of 25 years. God's promise to make Abraham into a great nation didn't happen immediately. There are important lessons here for us about discipleship. Firstly, God's call and its fulfillment often demands patient waiting. And we in the 21st century are not good at waiting. Timothy Radcliffe makes this point using the example of a plane crash in Canada in 2004. The pilots were carrying fresh vegetables from Africa to Western markets and had been flying for almost 24 hours. They were overcome by fatigue. Radcliffe writes, "Consumers expect to find asparagus and snap peas in the supermarkets all year round. They do not wish to wait until the due season. They want them now." The pilots fly for dangerously long hours. This is the fourth crash of a plane of this company since 1992. The founder of the company said that it is not the fault of the supermarkets. They are merely responding to market demands, which tolerate no waiting. We do indeed live in a society that tolerates no waiting. But God's timetable cannot be manipulated to satisfy our schedule. So lesson 1. God's call and its fulfillment often demands patient waiting. Secondly, God's call and its fulfillment does not have a statute of limitation or a use-by date. For some of us, the supreme call will come later in life, as it did for Abraham and Sarah, and for Simeon and Anna. In 1958, Angelo Roncalli was elected Pope at the age of 78 and took the name John the 23rd. It is difficult to know for certain what the College of Cardinals had in mind, but some commentators have suggested that Roncalli was elected to be a mere caretaker pope. John the 23rd was anything but a caretaker pope. By summoning the Second Vatican Council, he inaugurated a great era of renewal within the Church. Roncalli had kept a journal for most of his adult life, and it has been published under the title Journal of a Soul. One entry in his journal was written during a retreat he made during Holy Week of 1945. He was then aged 64. The journal entry reads, "I must not disguise from myself the truth. I am definitely approaching old age. My mind resents this and almost rebels, for I still feel so young, eager, agile, and alert. But one look in the mirror disillusions me." It was to be another 13 years before Angelo Roncalli was elected Pope at the age of 78. As Pope John the 23rd, he instigated a monumental period of renewal in the Church. And let us also remember Pope Benedict XVI, who was elected to the papacy at the age of 78, several years beyond the mandatory retirement age for bishops. And Pope Francis was elected Pope at the age of 76. Like Simeon and Anna, Popes John, Benedict, and Francis were called to do great things for God well beyond the traditional age of retirement. And that is a powerful reminder to all of us that God's call has no use-by date, no statute of limitations.